with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche Independent Candidate 2024, challenging Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And today is March 3rd. I would like to begin this evening with a short clip of another LaRouche movement organizer's intervention, and I'll let it this time with Ann Applebaum, who is married to Mr. Sikorsky, who had certain things to say about the Nord Stream pipeline, but I think I will let the clip explain it for you.
Just have a couple of questions. One, Seymour Hersh has published this expose that the
we can't hear anything if there's sound with this.
For the destruction of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. And yet he's an incredibly decorated journalist. He's been involved in exposing the My Lai massacre in the 1960s. He exposed the fact that the CIA was actually spying on our own citizens. And he exposed what was going on in Abu Ghraib in 2002. Now, you're talking all of this stuff about Ukraine, yet you're not mentioning that we had planned this attack on the pipelines in advance, much before the invasion. And this is an act of terrorism against Germany and against Russia. We're violating the sovereignty of one nation, and yet here we are talking about, the Russians are the bad guys. And what about the sanctions that we put on Syria? There was this horrific earthquake that hit Syria, that hit Turkey, and because of the sanctions, the Caesar sanctions which we put there, the required aid is not going to them because of our government sanctions and because we're occupying the northwest of that nation right now. So how is it that you can lie to all of us and say we're standing for democracy against this aggressor Russia when we're just as bad? We're terrorizing people all across the world, and we've destroyed a major piece of infrastructure.
I'm running the show, not you.
No. I want her to answer the question. Can you call for an international investigation into this Nord Stream sabotage? Can you acknowledge the fact that we've been terrorizing nations across the world, and we do not stand for democracy anymore? I want her to answer that.
We do stand for democracy. You want
No.
Ann Applebaum to answer?
I want an answer from Ms. Applebaum. And also, I would like you to wait, one more thing.
No.
Can you talk about why your husband, Mr. Sikorsky, why he put on Twitter, "Thank you, USA," after we bombed the Nord Stream pipelines? Why did your husband say that?
It was a joke.
It was a joke? Why did he delete it right after then?
Because the joke was misunderstood.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
You want to know the truth? So I'm not going to answer that at length. I mean, the Seymour Hersh article has been debunked repeatedly by many people. It's full of holes.
How is it full of holes? What are the holes?
So I'm not going to go into the details right now. I'm happy to point you to the people who've done it. It's not I haven't followed it in great detail. We can wait for the Swedish and other Baltic examinations.
Then why aren't they sharing the information with the international community? They're suppressing that information.
You're not going to accept.
No, I want her to answer it. We're on the brink of a nuclear war right now because mad people like her are pushing us on the brink of it. We're sending over $100 billion to Ukraine. Why can't I be concerned about the threat of nuclear war?
Thank you so much.
So you're not going to answer the question?
No. Thank you so much for your
We're on the brink of nuclear war right now.
Thanks,
You are going to kill a bunch of people. You are lying to all these people.
Thanks.
I have a right to be heard.
Thanks.
So now I should just say that aside from Sikorsky, I think was the former foreign minister of Poland. This woman has been a journalist with the London Economist and the Spectator and the Washington Post. The London Economist being the paper that in 2007 was projecting a future scenario where Russia would threaten to invade Ukraine, and Obama, who had not even been nominated yet, this is March of 2007, would threaten Russia with nuclear weapons to get them to back down. So again, just very important. And they have nothing to say about Seymour Hersh's Nord Stream 2 revelations because they have not been debunked. And the nations in Europe that are allegedly doing the investigations have said that they don't need to share the results of those investigations with anybody, including even members of their own parliaments. So the anti-war coalition continues. When we met last week, we were coming off of the previous Sunday, February 19th, Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C., which saw a very broad coalition of speakers, myself included, Tulsi Gabbard, Ron Paul, Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson, Garland Nixon, many others, Jose Vega. And then on this past Saturday, the 25th, you had demonstrations all over the world, including as many as 50,000 people in Berlin, Germany. You had thousands, a couple thousand in Ramstein. You had a few thousand people in London at a kind of indoor rally or teach-in. So the opposition to this brinksmanship, if you will call it that, of provoking war with Russia is growing, especially as the economies of the Western world collapse. Now, the resistance also is growing around the world, and we saw that with the Chinese putting forward a 12-point peace proposal for a ceasefire, indicating that they are taking a statesman-like role in the world, as opposed to any of the Western leaders who, frankly, are like a bunch of 2-year-olds with nuclear weapons. It's embarrassing, really, what heads of state are saying, from admitting that they lied about the Minsk process to Biden rushing over to Kiev to assure the Ukrainians that we want to keep supplying them with weapons, so they should keep dying for our war with Russia. But he has nothing to say to the people of East Palestine, Ohio, which we'll be talking about tonight. At the G20 meeting, the Prime Minister of India being the chair of that, said that he represents the global South, and that what he wants to talk about are things like the crisis in food, in energy, fertilizer, and debt. In other words, things that are in the real world that actually affect people. And although Biden claims that we have successfully isolated Russia, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, met with the foreign ministers of Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, China, and many other nations, including India. So the nation which is becoming isolated is the United States and the rest of the West. It is known that thanks to our brilliant policies, which Lyndon LaRouche warned about years ago, of deindustrialization and having a so-called service economy, which is a very interesting concept. What are you going to serve if you have no production? We aren't able to keep Ukraine supplied with weapons to fight Russia on our behalf, especially if we want to have another war against China. So this is really creating a terrible crisis. They're pouring it on. They are escalating the narrative. There have been many, many mainstream news media attacks on the Rage Against the War Machine, against this anti-war process. What are they freaked out about? How dare you have the so-called left and the so-called right being unified? We've spent probably billions of dollars dividing people, getting them to be hysterical about every minor disagreement or even major disagreement, so that we can come in and annihilate civilization. Well, apparently people aren't having it anymore. Now, you also may have seen that just a couple of days ago, there was a horrific train wreck in Greece, where the railroad workers, as the railroad workers in the United States have been warning, we're warning about the dangers for some time. Apparently, they had modernized various things on the tracks, but not the switching. they're blaming this accident on supposedly one person who switched a passenger train onto the wrong tracks. I think there's much more to be told there, and people have a sense, as we see from the war, that simply governments have been hijacked by financial interests. And the last thing I really want to stress, because I think we're on the cusp of a potential incredible breakthrough. It is very dangerous because the Western elites, the billionaires of the Great Reset and Davos, who had expected to run the world, are losing their grip and they're losing control of their own populations, which makes it dangerous. But on the other hand, their system is doomed. And part of what I want to take up in the symposia is how to think about the type of recovery or new paradigm that we really should be organizing. So to that end, the two speakers this evening are Richard Freeman and William Jones, both longtime associates of Lyndon LaRouche, both writers for Executive Intelligence Review, are going to be taking up the question of what happened in East Palestine and more behind that, what to think about in terms of rail, and the question of development corridors, how we can be thinking, what we should be doing, which I think will set in bold relief what has caused the problem. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard. So go ahead and welcome.
Thank you, Diane. I'm very happy to be here as always. If I could have the first slide, please, Jose. Okay, so on February 3rd in East Palestine, I think they pronounce East Palestine, but I'm going to stick with Palestine, or I may use Palestine. There was a derailment of several cars, 38 cars, in a 149-car Norfolk Southern freight train. And that's one of the headlines from Salem, Ohio, but people have seen these headlines all across the country, all across the world. This appears to have arisen from the company's incompetent setup and management of what's called its wayside defect detector system, which we'll explain, stemming from the rails industry's predatory stock buybacks, extracting large stock dividends, relentless downsizing, and 40 years of deregulation. We will look at what happened, which the anti-human being press has misreported, why it has happened, and what Lyndon LaRouche proposes as the sweeping fundamental steps that should be taken to correct it. Now, wayside defect detectors, which are commonly called hotbox detectors, use infrared sensors to assess the heating of rail car components, such as bearings, axles, and brakes by monitoring their temperature. And there's an even more advanced system that will also take the vibration of the ball bearings. According to reports, this rail derailment originated with car number 23, which I'll say something about. But this had an overheating wheel bearing that the National Traffic Safety Board suspects caused the entire derailment. Now, if I can have the next slide, please. This is Ohio, and this is very close, the Ohio part, which is Sebring, Salem, and East Palestine, which figure into our story, are right on the border with Pennsylvania. So you can see Cleveland up to your northwest, and you can see Pittsburgh to your northeast. What happened was that on the track at Sebring, so that's circled in the most westerly part, the car number 23 was 35 degrees Fahrenheit above what's called ambient air temperature, which is just the surrounding air temperature, and it's supposed to measure that. By the time it reached the detector in Salem, which you can see is the next one over going eastward, which is just 10 miles from Sebring, it recorded a wheel bearing temperature at 103 degrees Fahrenheit. That is greater than the surrounding air. This is quite hot, but Norfolk Southern standards don't call for the train to be stopped and inspected until the bearing reaches 115 degrees above the ambient temperature. That standard is very questionable. Between Sebring and East Palestine, which you can see, it's the next one over, the detectors should have been 10 miles apart, but this one was 20 miles apart. Why? We'll find out. By the time the train passed East Palestine's wayside defect detector, the trouble wheel bearing was 253 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient temperature. The entire wheel was on fire, which then ignited a fire among the plastic pellets that car number 23 was carrying. This led to the derailment. This raises some urgent questions. Why did Norfolk Southern, which is the company that owns these lines, not set a standard of 100 degrees above ambient air temperature for the train to be stopped? If it did so, it would have been stopped in Salem. Had that policy been in effect, further, second question is, why did Norfolk Southern not install a defect detector at 10 miles east of Salem? By that point, it would have been way above the 115-degree standard that Norfolk Southern was using, and they would have stopped the train. The third question is, why don't they have real-time monitoring at the Atlanta center of the headquarters of Norfolk Southern? Had it looked at the car's 23's wheels, it would have seen 35 degrees above at Sebring, 103 degrees above at Salem. This is not a linear equation. This is exponential. At that point, and the computers can tell them that in 3 seconds, they should have stepped in immediately themselves. None of that was done. Why? Let me show a video, which is 31 seconds, which has been making the rounds, because this makes even worse what happened. Do we have that video, and can we play it? Now, it's a little bit dark, but you're looking at a surveillance camera in Salem. Look what happens at a certain point. Is the train moving? Okay, we'll just go with the screenshots. That's perfectly fine. So this is the first thing. You can see the train in the background. It's a little bit dark. Let's go to the second screenshot, please. Okay, this is the third screenshot. Anyone notice anything out of place? Do you notice there's a fire under the wheels of the train? And this is from a surveillance camera. This is 20 miles before it reached East Palestine. It should have been shut down then. It was already on fire. This is how Norfolk Southern and the railroads run their business. Now, there were linemen, and there are specialized linemen called electronic leaders, and they maintain these hot boxes devices. 3 years ago, 3 years ago, Norfolk Southern had 5 of these linemen who would visually inspect these wayside detectors, which you just put into the rails. They're not terribly complicated. Today, they have 0. So they couldn't tell whether the wayside defect detectors were working. The answer is that we were going to see why this is the case. Why are all these 5 things the case? Next, please. Okay, this is a rail tanker car, and I just want to mention that contrary to a lot of the reporting of the press, not everybody, it was reported that the vinyl chloride in the 5 cars actually caught fire. Not true. What happened is that car number 23, which is run by a company like GATX, which is a leased company out of Chicago, was not regulated. I can't find out much about this, but they just put these on the cars. Was next to cars 24, 25, 26, and 27, which carried the vinyl chloride. But they did not catch fire. The authorities in Ohio and Pittsburgh ordered the cars to be breached, and then the liquid to go down a trench, and then they lit it. I will just say, I won't go into it now because we have other things, but a lot of the hysteria over these questions is just not true. There is a real question. People don't want to have something like in their neighborhood, but a lot of this stuff is just the most anti-human environmentalists trying to capitalize on this situation. But we can go to that on another occasion. Next one, please. So here's what happened. There was a wave of deregulation that devastated U.S. economic sectors. Brokerage security firms, June 14th, 1975. You can read the other ones. Airlines, 1978. Trucking, July 1st, 1980. Railroads, October 14th, 1980, 3 months later. Banking, October 12th, 1982, and the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, November 12th, 1999. We deregulated just about everything in our economy. Now, what's important about this? Well, we used to have something called the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was set up in 1881. It told the rail lines whether they could merge or not, whether they could get rid of and abandon lines, how much they could charge for certain fees, whether they could merge. That was done away with. They now had a world unto themselves. Next, please. Now, these are the big five rail companies. Most people don't know them. They know Citibank and Morgan and JP Morgan and Chase and so forth. But these are just run their industry like a barony, as much as the banks do. They're Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, Union Pacific, that's owned by Warren Buffett, Union Pacific, CSX, which is the Chesapeake line, Norfolk Southern Railway, and Kansas City Southern. And then there's two Canadian collaborators. They all merged. It used to be the Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe, but after the Staggers Act of 1980, which deregulated the rail system, they merged. It used to be the Norfolk and the Southern. They merged. What did they do? Next, please. Now, we're going to look at what they did and why they did it. So I'm going to hold this screenshot, but I want to tell you what they did. They decided they're a barony. There is every bit as nasty as you can imagine the banks are. From 2002 to 2009, without regulation, these railroads, this rail cartel, as I call it, raised their rates by 96%. They then went to something called precision scheduled management, where they could say, instead of carrying one type of locomotive, one type of car, like wheat or coal, they could carry as many as they wanted to. The rail cars went from 50 to 75 up to 125 to 150. You can't manage that, particularly if you don't distribute the weight, because you're going to get torque on one part as it goes around the curve, which won't be balanced by the torque on another part. And guess what? They will derail. And the train that derailed in East Palestine was 149 cars. It was only going 47 miles per hour. And as Bill Jones, my colleague and friend, will tell you, the Chinese trains go so much faster than that. How can you derail at 47 miles per hour? But it did. They also, this train disconnected because the rails are so large. It disconnected in Illinois before it ever got to Salem and so forth. This is a whole story unto itself. What they decided to do is that they were going to cut the number of workers and the equipment so that they could transfer that onto the balance account of profits. And they would cut necessary projects for upkeep to transfer that onto the balance account of the profits of the company. These big five today have 94% of all revenues of the industry. And the smaller 600 companies just are like the servants. Last point on this, in 1980, these companies earned $150,000 in revenues for every mile of railroad cargo they carry. Now they earn almost $900,000. That is 6 times. How did they do it? Well, let's see what they did. Oh, and they also put $140 billion into stock buybacks. Well, look at the rail employment. It went from 520,000 in 1980 when the Staggers Act deregulated the rail, and now it's down to 140,000. How's that for safety? And they only allow 1 engineer and 1 conductor per train. And the rail unions have been saying we need 2 engineers. These trains are so darn long. No. Next. Please. Skip that one, the next one. No, we should go back up one. Say it's the first one then. Nope. The other direction. Okay, down, please. Down. Down. Oh, okay. Well, the one that seems to have gotten eliminated was that they took the rail mileage from 165,000 to 92,000. Now, that has tremendous implications for the functioning of our rail system. But the amount of railroads that were abandoned, which would not have been allowed under deregulation, was over 100,000 miles because some of those were called Class 2. Class 1 earns on $900 million or more a year in revenue. So they slashed the rail mileage by more than 45%. They slashed the workforce by over 70%. And then the next one that you show, that's the color with the blue background, please. They, just since 2018, eliminated 35,000 rail workers. Just then. So you've got two processes. The precision management, which cut everything that you could. Then they invested in stock buybacks, 170,000, jacked up their price, got revenues because they will only service certain parts of the country, let other parts completely bare-boned. And by manipulating the stock, and this should be called insider trading, they got a double benefit because people got appreciation in their stock. And that's how they're turning record profits. They don't care. They don't care whether the rail service America or not. We care. Next, please. Okay. It's not just rail derailments, and there have been 5 rail derailments just in the last few days. I mean, they're occurring at the rate of 2.7 per day. This is a story that last year, there were companies in California that needed livestock feed, and Union Pacific was not delivering it to them. And they needed the wheat from Nebraska. They couldn't get it. So it's not just derailments. This is a broader picture. It doesn't deliver things on time. Next, please. Now, this is Connecticut. And some of our members are very familiar with Connecticut. It's hard to see it, perhaps, but these blue lines are abandoned rail lines in Connecticut. I told you 100,000 miles were eliminated. That's bigger than most rail systems in most countries. We eliminate more rail mileage than most countries have rail mileage. If you look at those light blue lines, they were all eliminated. So when you go up from White Plains to Stamford to Norwalk and so forth, Bridgeport, as you go up further to Hartford, eliminated. And what that meant was partly because manufacturing was being eliminated, but what reciprocally happens is when you can't have a rail line, unless you're going to use trucking, you shut down your factories. Next, please. Jose? Okay, and this is just, I won't go through it now, but this is an editorial that appeared on Waterbury, and it goes through the fact that it says, if you look at the big print, much of the public debate centered on the role of passenger rail. On the one hand, rail service was considered as essential a public utility as electricity, and it is. It's a public utility. We don't want to own it, but we do want to regulate it. Next, please. Now, Diane mentioned at the top of the show, the rail accident in Greece. Same reasons. This was, at that time, they said 35 people. It's now up to, or 45, it's now up to 57 people killed in Greece. This is going on around the world. It's the Western system, the West, which runs the so-called rules-based order. So rail accident, Greece, human error or systematic neglect. And what I've been describing is systematic neglect. Next, please. So let me say what Lyndon LaRouche said about this. And this is from something he said. And we have to regulate. And people have a strange idea of regulation. We don't plan to own the railroads. We don't want to. You don't want to own the railroads. We do want to tell them what they can't and can't do in the interest of the nation, in the interest of developing rail corridors. So LaRouche said this. So therefore, these areas are one of the first areas the president must act upon in a Franklin Roosevelt fashion. First of all, for government intervention and regulation to defend and improve the national rail system as a high priority investment project. Number two, we must save the air traffic system. Remember, they were deregulated within 3 months of each other in 1980. Both of these essential parts of our national economy security. So he must do that, meaning the president. Now that opens a larger area. We are now in the greatest depression in more than 200 years, right? That means we have to make some fundamental changes away from the policies of the past 35 odd years, and I would add now, 20 years later, 55 odd years, back to the policies of Roosevelt. and the policies of the post-Roosevelt period from 1946 to 1964. We have to go back to that kind of economic system now, which means a regulated system, end privatization, end deregulation, end the funny money monetary policies, all these things, which are all the same, but different aspects. Get back to the things that worked before. And what would we do with deregulation, re-regulation? And we should do it. And if people are serious about East Palestine, they can talk about it quite a bit, and some people genuinely are concerned. Say, you cannot abandon these lines. We're going to reestablish lines between parts of the cities. We are going to break into that kitty that you spent of $141 billion and use it for real productive rail systems, which we'll see. We are going to make sure that the price increases of 96% since 2002 come to an end. Next, please. So that's the problem. Now let's look at the solution. In 2006, Lyndon LaRouche proposed the Economic Recovery Act. I just want to say he was looking at the auto industry, but he was thinking of the rail industry and others. He said, if we allow the U.S. auto manufacturing industry to be destroyed, the USA becomes a virtual third world nation overnight. The nation's machine tool design capability, most of which is tied up in auto manufacturing firms, is lost. And he proposed his Economic Recovery Act, which would use the machine tools from what we're going into auto for now all these wonderful projects that we have to be used for. And this is what we wrote in EIR in 2008. We want to serve a mission. This mission is a large one. Trillions of dollars of investment in new high-speed electrified rail corridors, third and fourth generation nuclear power plants and transmission systems, high energy density water desalination and hydrogen fuel production, water management and treatment, replacing ancient river navigation systems with modern ones, repairing thousands of upstream dams and thousands of bridges, building components of NASA launch vehicles and satellites. So this is our orientation. Shift it. Stop the degradation. Start thinking of these as development corridors and that they're in the service of the nation. Next, please. Now, I just want to show you, after Lincoln, remember the Union Pacific and other railroads only got started in about 1866, 1867, after the British assassinated Lincoln. So look at the railroads built by 1870. Now look at what Lincoln's economic revolution, total economic revolution, one of the greatest, along with Roosevelt's, the nation's ever seen. By 1890, look what happened. What are these? These are rail development corridors that led to the cities like Chicago, Omaha, San Francisco. And we put on either side of these corridors towns. We built industries. Farms could get their stuff to market. That went with giving people 40 acres and a mule, or 160 acres, sorry. So we thought in terms of rail corridors. That's how our nation was built. Next, please. Just a couple more. Now, this is a plan that would build a high-speed rail project. Phase 1 would be 26,000 miles, and then phase 2, which is in the red, would bring it up another 16,000 to 42,000 miles. This would work. It will not work unless we break the rail cartel, because they use 97% what's called diesel electric. You carry along the fuel, which is the diesel fuel, and it powers an onboard generator. They will not give that up for high-speed electric rail unless we use the government for that purpose. And if we have to, build it alongside their rail tracks. I'm not saying that's the first thing we do. Next, please. Okay, and when we were talking about this, since Diane's running for Senate, there was whole-scale discussion of electrified high-speed rail and maglev. And this is a map that was produced back in a task force in January 4th, 2006. It goes up to Montreal. It goes along Highway 95 all the way to Niagara Falls. It goes south to New York City. It goes to Boston. This is the way people think when they're inspired and so forth. Next, please. Now, I know Bill will talk about this. I just want to show it. This is the Chinese. They've just broken the speed record with 350 kilometers per hour. That's 180 miles per hour. Freight. It can carry 110 tons. That's not the biggest, but it's light freight to medium-sized freight. It will be significant. Compare that to 47 miles per hour. This is the future. And what we have to in the United States, just to summarize, do three things. Re-regulate the rails. Take their 141 billion, which went into stock buybacks, and say, that's just speculation. We need a real rail system. Your vision of your rails is your vision of the progress of manufacturing and the people and the culture of your country. Number two, build the high-speed rail system that we know that we are capable of. And number three, do this subsumed within an economic boom that is overseen by the 10 principles of Helga LaRouche. That's a real mission. And I know Donald Trump went to East Palestine, and I know that Tulsi Gabbard did, and it's good to show your support. Do you have the courage to call for the re-regulation of the rail lines and to call for breaking that cartel and using this money for the next phase of a real development corridor and development of the United States?
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. A lot of people in the chat were expressing their outrage at the way this is run, and probably want to talk more about that. But we will go now to Bill Jones, who will speak about development corridors and who is one of our China desk editors at Executive Intelligence Review. So Bill, welcome, and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Diane. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this very important topic today. I would mention to Jose he should be ready, because I think he'll handle my three pictures that I have when I come to him about the middle of the speech, to be on the safe side here. Let me just take a quote in terms of railroads and their significance. The railroad is like a leaven, which creates a cultural fermentation among the population. Even if it passed through an absolutely wild people along its way, it would raise them in a short time to the level requisite for its operation. This was a quote from Sergei Witte, who was the finance minister of Russia in the late 1800s and who initiated the Trans-Siberian Railroad, based largely on the success of the Transcontinental Railroad here in the United States. Witte was a student of the American system, which he learned through the work of Friedrich List. And as a result of his activity and the railroad, Russia developed from a largely agricultural population to an industrial power. He was making this statement in a series of lectures that he was giving, excuse me, to Mikhail Romanov, who was the heir to the Tsar at the time. He was the brother of Tsar Alexander III. Now, Alexander later had a son, so he did not become the Tsar, but this was what Witte was trying to educate the future leader of Russia in terms of economics. It's also, the railroad is also, as Richard Friedman mentioned, a corridor of development. Now, that's a concept which is easily understandable, but I think it probably was made into a real working concept by Lyndon LaRouche, who insisted on this notion of a railroad. A railroad doesn't necessarily have to be that either. Cecil Rhodes in Africa wanted to build railroads too, and the railroads, would pull the diamonds and everything else out of Africa into the pockets of the British. But if you have a development policy, if you organize that, the railroad then becomes the corridor, the transmission belt of development. LaRouche actually used that in the work that he was doing together with his wife on the development of the Eurasian land bridge way back in the 1990s, building what they call the new Silk. The Soviet Union, that was what's going to happen to them. How do you bring them into the mainstream of commerce? And he came up with the idea, well, you build a railroad from Rotterdam all the way to the coast of China. This was really the embryo of what today we know as the Belt and Road Initiative. And this was the concept behind it, the idea of a corridor of development. Between 1876 and 1969, the center of technological interest, the main height of technology, was here in the United States of America. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case today. If you want to see the future, if you want to see the potential that exists, you really have to go to China. This was not obvious. What happened in the United States, Richard gave a very dramatic picture of what is called shareholder value, which has unfortunately dominated the U.S. economy for about the last 40 years. And we counterpose to that the notion of people's livelihood as they use in China. We also have that concept, the general welfare. We know it, we hear it, we very rarely act upon it, as we have seen with this accident. But that's a certain loss of a certain mindset that we had at one time that is necessary to bring back. In China, that has been taken up. After the opening up in 1978, after they got out of the mess that was the Cultural Revolution in the old Mao era, they looked for examples to follow. And they looked at the United States very closely. And they had a decision to make. What do we do in this large country to bring our people together? Do we do what the United States did from the 1950s, build a major highway system? That was Eisenhower's plan, to build the highways. Maybe we don't want to be so dependent on automobile traffic. And so they chose a different path. They were going to use the railroads as the main means of bringing together the nation. And they moved on that very quickly. It was also an old idea that Sun Yat-sen had way back in the 1920s. He had a big map of the railroads. So that tradition was already there. They probably moved them in this direction. And this is shown to be a tremendous success. By the 1990s, they had a tremendous interest in high-speed rail. High-speed rail, as far as I understand it, was probably developed by a gentleman in New York by the name of Jim Powell, who I think had the first patent on it. But it was never done in the United States. He could never get people to get interested in this. It was, however, taken up by France, by Japan, and by Germany. And when the Chinese became interested in that, they looked at these issues. Deng Xiaoping, on his first trip to Japan, took a trip on the Shinkansen high-speed rail. So there was an interest in this. They bought some of the technology. They were able to use some of the technology from especially from the Japanese and from the Germans in developing their own system, and they made it their own. They borrowed and they perfected, and by doing that, they have now become really the top dogs in terms of the high-speed rail system because they've built so many of them. They have approximately, I think it's much more now. I was looking at the last figure, was 46,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. But they're going to build, I think, 12,000 more kilometers in the next 5-year plan, which will be decided in the next few days, or will present in the next few days at the National Congress. So they have really become the major players in the high-speed rail area, and people are going to them from many countries in the developing world to see how to do it, to get advice, and also to get help through this Belt and Road Initiative. Let me show you the 3 pictures quickly if Jose has them there. The first, of course, you will recognize from Richard Freeman's picture. Not the same one, but it's similar. Do we have that, Jose? Pick one. I hope. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay, you see the nose there. A very sleek design, of course, you see. That isn't for aesthetic reasons. It looks beautiful, but it's not for aesthetic. This is for aerodynamic reasons, because these babies go up to 400 kilometers an hour. They usually travel around 300 kilometers an hour or so. And so the aerodynamics of the structure is extremely important. And these have been designed, the track, the design of the trains, etc., have all become a Chinese design based on early designs that they had from the Japanese and the Germans, and that's really their baby. And they're working on new ones now. They've done one maglev between Shanghai and in the airport in Shanghai, but they are going to move into that direction as well. This has allowed them tremendous things that they can do. They are able, through these rail lines, to connect all the major production centers in a very rapid sense. You have to look, it allowed them, for instance, they had most of the development in the beginning of the reform and opening up happened on the coastal areas. They became really the cheap labor for the world market. But the Chinese also had, in contrast to many of the other developing countries that did that and never got out of it, China had this program of leapfrogging, of finding those areas in which they could become experts. They could develop their expertise, which would allow them to move from cheap labor to high value producers. And that has been a very successful policy. But much of their population is still rural, and they live in the western parts of the country and in the central part of the country, and you had to get to them somehow. They could not be left behind. And the policy of the government was not to let them be left behind. And therefore, bringing the railroad to them allowed the development of new cities in the center and in the western regions. And of course, when the wall came down, and new countries like in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, then developed, Chinese wanted to have access to trade through to Central Asia and through Central Asia to Europe, so that they could extend these lines going out in the west to all the way to Europe and to trade, which has been the basis of this Belt and Road Initiative. It also allowed all the major cities to be connected by rail. China has what they call first tier, second tier, and third tier cities, depending on the size of them. I think at this point, almost all of the cities, except for a few third tier cities, are connected by rail. And the goal coming out of this new Congress and the weekend will be to connect all the major cities, first, second, and third tier, to rail connection. I'll show you. This is the map of the high-speed rail only. This is the, I think at that time, 46,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. I don't have the entire rail map, but if you look at this map and you realize that there are 8 north-south rails of regular, not high speed, but regular classical rail, and 8 east-west lines going in, that everything is really interconnected at this point. What does that do? This is a tremendous increase in productivity. You can imagine the rate of goods, the turnover of goods that is possible because of the speed of these things has changed the entire environment, the entire geometry of economic life. There was an example that was given that was more on the personal side. If you're a businessman, in Beijing, you can do the following. You can have your morning meeting in Beijing. You can get on a high-speed rail, go to Shanghai, 689 miles away. You're there for the afternoon. Take your afternoon coffee. If you want to, you could take another train to Hangzhou, which is beautiful city on the West Lake, and have a dinner meeting with somebody, and you can hop on the train again and go the 1,275 miles back to Beijing, and you're back at about 10 o'clock at night, right? You can imagine the personal productivity you get in that. But that also has to do with the flow of goods, and the flow of items all over. A tremendous increase there. It also allows you to create larger production hubs. The example of that is especially in the south of China, where you had, because everybody knows about Hong Kong, but there was also Macau. There's a city, which is about, about 50 miles away in Guangzhou. And you had the city of Shenzhen, which is really well known today. 1970, this was farmland. Most of this stuff was. And there were 4 or 5 relatively, important industrial cities by the 1990s. And what happens with these rails that are connected have brought that into one single production unit, tremendous production unit. It is greater than the other great harbor cities of this nature are around the New York area, the entire area around New York City and the harbor there. Tokyo was the second one. Now this is going to outclass this, and it's been brought together because you've been able to condense space by limiting the time. So it's the space time of the economy that is the basis of this thing. This has been integral to everything else that China has been doing. People know about the poverty alleviation campaign. How did this happen? You have people living in isolated villages, sometimes up in the mountains and the like. By building the high-speed railroad, you had more connection from the major centers, city centers, out into the villages. And you had people, because you had a policy of poverty alleviation. I mean, we talked about the war on poverty in 1968. And that didn't quite get off the ground, but at least it was a policy there that said we're going to try and do something about this. The Chinese said the same thing, and they have done something about it. And they've done something because they've been able to mobilize the population, especially a lot of the young people, college graduates who come out looking for jobs. That there are these opportunities of going to these villages and working with the villagers who have really no education at all, except grade school or less, to talk to them about how they can take their production units and turn them into something much more profitable. It used to be these small farms. Everybody had their little piece of land that they could rent they could lease for 30, 40, 50 years. They don't own the land still in China, but they could lease it so that the families were there for a long time. But they were small plots and they were not very productive. So you had people go out there and say, let's bring these together. Let's, for instance, concentrate on a product that we can do in this neighborhood and sell it to an international market. And you could sell it to an international market because those products could then go very quickly from the production center out to the rest of the country. So instead of farming for yourself or farming for the local neighborhood, you now had an international market. And this connectivity, of course, was not only the trains, but it was also the internet and everything else. So yeah, the e-commerce just became booming on this thing, and people became very, very wealthy. I mean, they had to get used to the idea because they've been doing the other thing for hundreds of years, and now it was a big change. But it just created an entirely different system of activity for them. So these things were all made possible by the development of the railroads, and you will see more of this stuff going on. The idea is that you want to increase the speed of everything. You're changing the economic geometry. Lyndon LaRouche used to talk about this. He said the economics was not just expanding or becoming bigger and bigger or quicker. The idea is that you are shifting from one manifold, as he would call it, to the next. That is, you're going into a different type of space-time. And sometimes when you come from the United States and you go to China, and there are a lot of surprising things happening. That, for instance, you go into a restaurant, you get ready to pay, and the person said, "Oh, we already did that online. That's all taken care of." I mean, it was just the rate of change has just been so different. It's just a different environment entirely. And that's really what you want to aim for in terms of economic planning. You want to, emphasis on the innovation, on the science and technology in order to take a leap into an entirely new geometry. And the Chinese have learned that lesson in their own way. And this is the basis of what they're doing. Now, a lot of people here are not very happy about that, because as Richie said, you look at the situation here and see, why are the Chinese doing so good? Look, they had our ideas. We developed the maglev, at least conceptually, and we did these other things. I say they borrow and they perfect Leibniz used this concept in Russia in his letters to Peter the Great. He says, you want to take what you get here and perfect it in Russia. And that's legitimate. You do that. I mean, that's the work of the human mind. And here we have these people say, we got to stop this Chinese development, which has been so beneficial for the rest of the world, because, we have got to be the top dogs here, instead of thinking, okay, what have we done wrong? And how do we change what we have done wrong? The only thing I think that the Chinese have really stolen is our mindset. And that's the mindset that we had until 1969. In GE had the slogan, progress is our most important product. That is no longer the case. Now it is the shareholder value that Richard, indicated, showed, laid out so sharply in this railroad thing. And unless we can get back to the way we were thinking, and I think we can do that by, together with the Chinese, who are happy to work with us and would like to do that. They still see the United States as their most important partner, although we're not offering partnership today. And therefore, things are getting very bad. But we've got to change the way we think, as Richard gave some of the indications of some of the concrete measures that we have to do. And if we change the mindset, we'll find ourselves in a much different environment, much different space-time than that which we're living in right now. Thank you, Ben.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So both of you have covered a lot in a short time. I have a number of questions, but are you suggesting that the Chinese weather balloon was not spying on our railroad infrastructure?
If that was the case, Diane, it would have shot itself down.
I had a joke. I had a joke by that. The Chinese are really using their weather balloon to spy, and we're shooting them down. Watch out when they start flying kites. They're harder to shoot down.
Yeah, right. And I was reading, we spent $2 million shooting down somebody's science project. So I'm really glad we did that. And, I mean, I think it does kind of get at this unbelievable arrogance and ignorance. I'm sorry to say, I don't think that people are stupid per se. And that is, people are not uneducable, but because of the control of our educational system and the news media, people are exceedingly ignorant. They don't know what's happened in China. I mean, if they did, they would say, well, why the hell would they even want it? I mean, what is there to steal from us? Unless you have some nefarious person who wants to destroy China, then they might come over here to find out the best way to do it. How can we take down our rail grids and et cetera? So, it really is something. A couple of questions have come in. One, just a note, 350 kilometers per hour is 217 miles per hour.
Right. So, I was going to look that up, but I
was going to correct myself. I just
good.
Multiply by 6, and it's 200. It should have been 210.
It's like 217. To magnify, it's 53 minutes between Washington and New York.
On a freight train.
50.
On a freight train. I mean, that's the thing. I think I had read that the average speed of a freight train now, 47 miles per hour, is actually very high, because I think the average speed of these things is 17 miles per hour. So it's terrible. At any rate, Richard, someone wrote, why did Biden refuse to meet with the railroad workers?
Well, this is an interesting thing. The railroad workers who we're saying we need 2 engineers and 1 conductor. And the president has the ability to enforce a cooling off period. Biden wouldn't have been the first president. Many presidents have done that. So what Biden says, well, I'll give you the wage increase, but I will not allow you to have a second engineer. And the engineers have a lot of experience. They have knowledge, and they are additional minds and eyes. One example I read from one rail engineer, and by the way, in Ohio, some of the best things that are being said, there's a lot of hot air are coming from the railroad workers unions, the different brotherhoods, because they have been fighting this question for a while. There were in the 1970s there were derailments in East Palestine, and so forth. This is not new there. But the thing is, Biden was not going to allow for this more important change. And the other change that the rail workers were saying is, look, we have to be on call. That means if we get a call at 12 o'clock at night, we have to leave our home and be at a rail station at 2 in the morning, because they are so, the workforce is so stretched thin that they are demanded to be ready to go whenever they want, or they're needed. They have to give up weekends. They didn't until recently. Norfolk Southern just granted, after the accident, certain levels of paid leave. It's barony, it's feudalism, and feudalism is not. People say, well, feudalism is a stage of development. It's not a stage of development. It's a backward level. When people lived in the American South after the Civil War, but you still had Jim Crow. It was complete feudalism, high illiteracy, and so forth. So the point is, he's supposed to be the labor president. He goes and says, I'm going to have decent wages. His policy on this is not much different, as his policy is not that much different for the last 20 years on Ukraine. It's as Bill was saying, I think very forcefully, it's a mindset. We have to change the mindset. But the answer to your question was, I don't know. I didn't talk to Biden, but I think it's kind of obvious this shareholders value policy is going to continue because, and one thing that happens under the shareholder value is you get beaten back. But the point is, you have to issue an economic report roughly every quarter and on certain things every month. And the president gets in there and he gets trapped. And instead of saying, no, we're going to take this thing apart and do what LaRouche says, even if they don't know LaRouche, but we're going to do what has to be done justly, because one's vision for one's rail system is one's vision for the nation and one's vision for the people. So that's the best I can tell you. I don't, without having been inside the White House.
Also, well, here's a thought, because Bill, you described the railroad, and I think all transportation, it's really crucial to eradicating poverty. This question of connectivity, of giving people access to each other, access to markets, access to production. Do you think it's the case that getting rid of transportation corridors, like getting rid of rails, increases poverty? Because you would say that we decided to get rid of the rails as part of a policy of poverty already increasing. But I think this may have affected us a lot more than we would think about.
I think that probably wasn't the goal per se. I mean, the goal was really to, the shareholder value thing. We can't afford it. It's not profitable, etc. But I think that is the result, because you have, you somehow lose the connection. Look at the East Palestine. There's a railroad connection there. People can get there, but nobody's really going there. And, in terms of trying to deal with this thing. So I think that's always the case. The eliminating infrastructure without taking another step toward a higher infrastructure, I think is going to undermine your development. We've had a full takedown of that over the last 40 years, and we've seen that, and especially in our inner cities. I mean, the hospital systems, the transportation systems, the social services, all of that is going by the board because of shareholder value, and that has led to a situation where we're becoming a very poor country, unfortunately. But I think that's absolutely necessary. You have to have a greater connection. I mean, you have to move in the direction where people can move more freely and not more with more difficulty in order to have a functioning economy, because it's not only people, it's also goods and services and everything else that you have to have. That's really the key, to development.
One thing I would just add on this is that if you look at the East Palestine, the People went in there and they said, well, I don't want to address it in a big way now, but a lot of the stories about vinyl chloride, which is what the tankers that were burned, that it would leave permanent damage. It's just not true. There's science on this. I looked up what the EPA says. It has a life span in the air of 0.2 to 0.5 days, which means about 5 hours to 12 hours. That's in the whole question. But people shouldn't wake up and having these things dumped on their doorsteps. It did cause some bronchitis and other things which are important, but the key thing, you don't know when it's going to occur again. And the thing is, if you want to stop that, stop the derailments. And if you don't want to take on the derailments and the power of this rail cartel, you're not going to stop the derailments. You're not going to restore rail, we have the capacity to link up whole portions. If we build 20 to 25 new cities, and Diane and I discussed this the last time I was on the show, you need rail. And not only that, we need rail to go faster and be the type of space-time changer in our entire economy, because it's like a conveyor belt. If it takes you 12 hours to get something from one place to another, or if it takes you 4 hours by using high-speed rail, think of what you can accomplish in a productive process in the course of a day. But the additional feature of this is that look at where East Palestine and Sebring and Salem are located. Well, Cleveland got demolished. Pittsburgh is now another city. It doesn't produce the steel that it used to. This is a depressed area. If somebody is genuinely concerned about helping the people of this area, and East Palestine its population has been going down year by year. It's got now about 4,700 people. Build it. Do what LaRouche is saying to do. It will also help those people. If you're really saying that you do want to help them, make this necessary transformation of the whole productive process of our nation. And the last thing I would just add is, this is so much fun. You look at these experiments that are being done on high-speed rail, and it was done, as William said, it was Brookhaven Lab, which is where James Powell and then James Jordan and others worked out of. And of course, your wife, Marcia, knows a tremendous amount about this as well, as you do. This was developed, and they couldn't get the funding. And eventually, at a certain point, the Japanese came over in the 1970s and said, well, we'll buy your patents. And they were so depressed that they did it. Think about the question of fusion. Paul Gallagher gave a very good presentation a number of weeks ago on this question. We're behind in fusion. We starve our fusion power program for what it needs. We have certain ideas on tokamaks, but also theta pinch and all sorts of things. They never get developed. We're doing this repeatedly. It's up and down. It's a mindset. It is a policy. We have to see ourselves differently in the world. And if the United States were to be told to cut out this nonsense, and I do think deregulation, by the way, has to be done. It's just like the banks. Banks said in 2007, 2008, oh, yes, we'll reform our ways, mea culpa, mea culpa. Well, what did they do? They got worse. They invested in all the garbage. They will never do that. We have to do it as a government. But if the United States united, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche is calling for, with China, and China has repeatedly extended open offers for us to do so, what a benefit to the world. And it's this insane mindset. I mean, we can now attack, use Taiwan to attack China. It doesn't even make sense militarily. But what I'm saying is, it's two different visions of the world. And that what we're doing right now to stop the war in Ukraine and to bring the United States and China together with Russia and the whole BRICS process, it's the same revolutionary shift. It's just in a different sphere.
Can I say something about this Biden thing? I just don't want to leave him off the hook. I think he really just doesn't care. He was so much involved in trying to create this choreography, this theater piece of going to Ukraine in order to bring them the more weapons into it, that he just wasn't concerned about that. And that's his mindset. All right? And even when he got back, he didn't do it. I mean, it's not only the most immoral thing. The first thing that a president would do would be to go there. Look, Xi Jinping does this all the time. He doesn't always go himself, but he always sends somebody and makes sure that he is present in these tragedies, that the hand of the government is clearly indicated there. That was not the case in East Palestine. And I think Biden is losing it politically, whatever political sense he has, because this is going to come back to haunt him. Because I think every blue collar worker is focused on this train incident, what happened there. And they see what the president has just refused to do. And I think that's going to hurt him very bad politically. So I think he's losing his political sense. Not only is he immoral, but he's losing his sense of political reality in doing that. But I think that's just because that's the way that's his outlook. That's who he is. He
Well,
really
also, you said we have 2-point-something train derailments or incidents per day? Did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Buttigieg.
I got the conversion wrong. It was 217 miles per hour.
Buttigieg himself said at some point that there are 1,000 each year. They asked him about what are you going to do about East Palestine? Oh, East Palestine. Look, we have train wrecks all the time. 1,000 a year.
Yeah. No, not every train wreck can be prevented, just like not every car wreck can be prevented, not every plane. But there are things you can do. And it's, for example, why is it up to the rail line that they decided, well, we'll put a hot box detector 10 miles apart, and then we won't put the next one to 20 miles apart. And we have no monitoring system for surveillance cameras, which we don't know where they came from, but they look like they came from the rail line itself.
I have to say, they surveil everything we do. I mean, but they can't surveil anyway, I'm sorry, go on.
No, and you're right, because look, we've reached this. How do we run our space program? We have to have monitoring systems, and they have what's, you would call in the old language, a governor. There's a feedback mechanism. So every time it feeds back, you make adjustments, you make readings. These should be, one suggestion I would make if we regulated the railroads is put them on the dashboard of the trains. These engineers could be able to read them. You're absolutely correct, Diane. To throw this out, the only reason is you want to take money out of the productive economy to get your stock to rise to a higher level. It has nothing at this point. Anyway, point well taken.
Can I say on this high-speed rail, if you're riding on it, I didn't mention this, but it's important people to know, especially those who ride a Acela or one of the other trains between Washington and D.C., and you're jerking around, all the way up there. If you're on one of these high-speed rails, you can stand with a cup of coffee in the middle of the aisle, and that coffee is not going to spill. And if you go online and look at some of this is quite amazing the way they've done that. That there is a video of a person who put a coin on the side. I can't do. I tried to do it with a quarter and I couldn't do it, but they were able to do it with the coin as the train was moving, and the coin did not fall.
You mean on the standing up like round like that?
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, it's time to wrap up. I just did want to say one thing. When you think of this idea of 1,000 derailments or whatever incidents a year, and people say, oh, well, it's sort of like, oh, and the dog doesn't like that at all. Maybe someone can open the door here and let him go out of this room, Suzanne. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so the idea that this is this is the thing that is so depraved about the culture in the United States and why it's so urgent to have conversations like this. It's as if to say, oh yeah, every 6-year-old is raped routinely, so we're just going to tolerate it. This is just how things happen. Oh yeah, it's perfectly normal for children to have only one meal per day, or any of this other stuff. You know what I'm saying? We have come to accept the most insane. In Brooklyn, New York, right now, it's an issue that people's cars are getting destroyed by rats. You have so many rats on the street, they're getting into the inside of people's cars and eating all of the wiring. Why is that normal? That is really dark age conditions, and we now act like it's normal. It's just, at any rate, it has to change.
The rats are leaving Wall Street.
Yeah, the sinking ship. Lynn's saying that we're going to bury Wall Street so deep that we can't smell the stench anymore, I think is a good policy. And then the rats won't be able to find it. Maybe some of them will die off. I don't know. But do either of you have anything that you'd like to just add quickly in closing? I have one announcement to make, but I'll say that in a minute.
I would just say in 15 seconds, the proposals that I made, which LaRouche raised, we should really think about them. There's various ways you can start to re-regulate. It's not like re-regulation is not like, oh, I'm just going to slap someone's fist. It is a policy of the state saying these are utilities, and the railroad is really a utility. We've given you a lot of privilege. We've given you the ability to make profit. We're not going to take that away, but we are going to set conditions without which we don't have a rail system that services the nation. And it may seem like it's just, quote, regulation. That's protectionism. In a paper that LaRouche wrote, Trade Without Currency, he refers to regulation in his context. You can get it. It doesn't always say it directly, as just a form of protectionism. And it's something that when Roosevelt did this in the 1930s and 40s, he had outright wars with these people, but he did it.
I would just say that people should, if they have an opportunity, they should go to, sites like CGTN, which is their television studio, to watch some of the stuff that they have there. Because, you get the issue that this is the Chinese propaganda, but it's not just, telling you what they think. They're showing you what's going on. And when you look at some of this stuff, it's very exciting. People will get excited about this, even though this is happening in China, because it's going on. It's being done. And when you see that and people understand that undercuts the propaganda that you're getting from CNN and MSNBC, but it also gives you, I think, a sense of hope that the world does not have to be in this kind of destructive mode, that there are ways out of it. And I think that would be important for people to know, both in terms of understanding what China is going on, to see what the possibilities are here in the United States as well, if we get back into that mindset.
Right, exactly. The point is, none of this, as FDR said, we aren't in this situation because of a natural disaster. We're in this situation because of the willful choice of the economic royalists, a criminal policy decision, which could be reversed and must be reversed. So I want to thank you both very much. Just for those of you who are watching live, if you're in the New York area, there will be a rally tomorrow of the Schiller Institute against the sanctions in Syria. And the dog is very moral. He is extremely concerned about what is happening there, which is that they had an earthquake, and our Congress is so disgusting and criminal-minded that they voted on Monday 412, I think, to 2, with a dozen or so abstentions, to make sure the Caesar sanctions remained imposed on Syria. This is a country where 90% of the people are below the poverty line, where the sanctions mean it's actually illegal to send aid to this country. If you think about the people we saw being dug out of holes in Turkey a couple days later, they couldn't do that in Syria. They didn't have spare parts. They didn't have earth-moving equipment. Now you have 5 million people homeless, and Americans are unaware of this. Or I actually met students who had yesterday who had the same argument as our disgusting spokesperson for the State Department, Ned Price, who said that because Assad supposedly is bad and supposedly used chemical weapons against his own people, all of which has been disproven, but even if it were true, which it's not. Therefore, we should definitely not help the people of Syria because Assad might take credit for it. So better to have millions of people homeless and starving. So tomorrow at 3 o'clock in New York City at 6th Avenue and 34th Street, if you want to join this sort of rally vigil against these sanctions and calling for support for House Concurrent Resolution 20, which was introduced by Congressman Matt Gaetz to get American troops out of Syria. And everyone should call their congressman to do that. But these are two matters. One, we should get our troops out of there. They're doing nothing but stealing wheat and occupying oil fields and generally creating more tension. And two, lift the sanctions. So that's what I want to say. Thank you both for being here. And we have a lot of work to do. So thank you.